Hi, my name is Bob. I'm one of the pastors here at the meeting place. Hi. So one of my responsibilities here working at the meeting place is that I lead the lead team. And one of the functions of me leading the lead team is that I'm responsible for their care. So every month we set aside an hour, which is an interruption in our busy schedule, and make that 1 hour about care for the individuals who are on the lead team. I have a series of questions that I ask. I don't always get to all of them because sometimes the conversation goes in perhaps unexpected places. But on this list of questions, my favorite question is this. The question is, what are you longing for? And this gives me access to great insight. I spend my time with very creative people who have an imagination for the future. They are leaders. They're keeping their eye on the horizon line. And so by me asking, what is it that you're longing for, I sometimes gain access to some of the dreams that they have, some of the things they're hoping for to experience in the future. And in that moment, we can figure out how I can perhaps find the resources to try to accomplish this longing that they've declared. And sometimes I need to say to them, no, we're never going to go in that direction, or that's never going to happen. So I'm sorry to burst your bubble, but that longing cannot be fulfilled. Try again. Find another one. Be creative about something else. So this morning, for you that are here and for you online, I want to bless you with the question, what are you longing for? Let me be clear. Some of you have just thought of something, and you were confronted by the fact that you're in church where you're supposed to have noble thoughts. And for just a moment, you sort of thought to yourself, yeah, that longing, that's maybe not the best thing. I don't know if that's really honoring to God or my faith convictions, but it's the truth. And just for a moment, I want to give you permission to hang on to the very first longing that came to mind, even if perhaps you wouldn't share it with your neighbor because you're a little embarrassed about it. But just for a moment, let's hang on to our longings. This idea that there's something in the future that you're hoping for, and it could be something just very material. It could be something, like I said, not particularly inspiring, and yet it's a longing that was true because it was the first thing that came to mind. Some of you, of course, have had very lofty ideas about what longings you have and so on like that. So just rest in those longings for a moment. If you're just jumping into the series that we're in right now, I'd like to encourage you to make sure to go back and watch last Sunday's teach. Paul Walker, our teaching pastor, I think did an excellent job of starting off this series, which is really all about finances. And so he laid the groundwork, and I think it's worth for you to watch what he said to give you context for what is to follow today and also next Sunday. Last Sunday, Paul then addressed the question or the statement of earn all you can. Today, we're talking about save all you can. And then next Sunday, we're going to talk about give all you can. So in order to perhaps explore this, I want to take you to a passage. It's a little bit of a longer story, but I think you'll find it intriguing. I first heard it as a child growing up in a home where my parents would tell Bible stories, and I remember being somewhat frustrated with the story, and I'll share with you some of my frustrations, and then we'll make some observations about it. It's found in Genesis chapter 41. It says this, when 2 full years had passed, Pharaoh had a dream. He was standing by the Nile when out of the river there came up 7 cows, sleek and fat, and they grazed among the reeds. And after them 7 other cows, ugly and gaunt, came up out of the Nile and stood beside those on the riverbank. And the cows that were ugly and gaunt ate up the 7 sleek, fat cows. Then Pharaoh woke up. He fell asleep again and had a second dream. 7 heads of grain, healthy and good, were growing on a single stalk. After them 7 other heads of grain sprouted, thin and scorched by the east wind. The thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 healthy full heads. Then Pharaoh woke up. It had been a dream. In the morning, his mind was troubled, so he sent for all the magicians and wise men of Egypt. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but no one could interpret them for him. Then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, today I am reminded of my shortcomings. Pharaoh was once angry with his servants, and he imprisoned me and the chief baker in the house of the captain of the guard. Each of us had a dream the same night, and each dream had a meaning of its own. Now, a young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. We told him our dreams, and he interpreted them for us, giving each man the interpretation of his dream. And things turned out exactly as he interpreted them to us. I was restored to my position, and the other man was impaled. Parents, be careful telling Bible stories to your children. So Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and he was quickly brought from the dungeon. When he had shaved and changed his clothes, he came before Pharaoh. I cannot do it, Joseph replied to the sorry, we're missing some things here. I cannot do it, Joseph replied to Pharaoh. This is after Pharaoh told his dream about the 7 cows and the 7 grains. We've skipped some verses. And now Joseph responds to Pharaoh and he says, I cannot do it, I cannot interpret, but I know that God can help me. God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. We continue. Sorry, Rejoice, that's my mistake, not yours. Carry on. Pharaoh said to Joseph, I had a dream and no one can interpret it, but I have heard said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. So that's the prior thing. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, the dreams of Pharaoh are one and the same. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good heads of grain are 7 years. It is one and the same dream. The 7 lean, ugly cows that came up afterward are 7 years, and so are the 7 worthless heads of grain, scorched by the east wind. They are 7 years of famine. It is just as I said to Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. 7 years of great abundance are coming throughout the land of Egypt, but 7 years of famine will follow them. Then all of the abundance in Egypt will be forgotten, and the famine will ravage the land. The abundance in the land will not be remembered because the famine that follows it will be so severe. The reason the dream was given to Pharaoh in 2 forms is that the matter has been firmly decided by God, and God will do it soon. And now let Pharaoh look for a discerning and wise man and put him in charge of the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh appoint commissioners over the land to take 1/5 of the harvest of Egypt during the 7 years of abundance. They should collect all the food of these good years that are coming and store up the grain under the authority of Pharaoh to be kept in the cities for food. This food should be held in reserve for the country to be used during the 7 years of famine that will come upon Egypt, so that the country may not be ruined by the famine. And the plan seemed good to Pharaoh and to all his officials. So Pharaoh asked them, can we find anyone like this man, one in whom is the Spirit of God? Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has made all of this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all of the people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you. So Pharaoh said to Joseph, I hereby put you in charge of the whole land of Egypt. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from Pharaoh's presence and traveled throughout Egypt. During the 7 years of abundance, the land produced plentiful. Joseph collected all the food produced in those 7 years of abundance in Egypt and stored it in the cities. In each city, he put the food grown in the fields surrounding it. Joseph stored up huge quantities of grain, like the sand of the sea. It was so much that he stopped keeping records because it was beyond measure. The 7 years of abundance in Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began, just as Joseph had said. There was famine in all of the other lands, but in the whole land of Egypt there was food. When all Egypt began to feel the famine, the people cried to Pharaoh for food, and then Pharaoh told all the Egyptians, go to Joseph and do what he tells you. When the famine had spread over the whole country, Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold grain to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe throughout Egypt, and all the world came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph because the famine was severe everywhere. This is the story. And I remember as a child hearing this story, and I was a little frustrated by it because in my head, and I knew that this was a dream, but in my head it made no sense to me that these fat, healthy cows that came up out of the Nile in Pharaoh's dream can be consumed by these gaunt and ribs showing kind of cattle. It didn't make sense, those two things, and yet, now that I've lived a few more years, I've discovered the truth of this, and that is that we very quickly forget the abundance of the plenty when we start facing the realities of a famine. When we start running short and we don't have the resources in place to cover the circumstances of our life, what happens is we forget that there were days that weren't like that weren't weighed down by this reality. A few years ago, at Young Adults, we invited a guest speaker to come to help young adults figure out how to manage their finances in the best way possible. Great opportunity at their age to start really good practices as far as finances are concerned. We had a guest speaker who is here this morning who joined us that evening, or those 2 evenings, and shared. And I'll be honest that of all the things that I heard, there's really only one nugget that I remembered. And he'll be a little disappointed that I didn't take notes of all the other things that he said, because there was only this one thing that really resonated with me. Now, you know this to be true. If you've ever been at a PD opportunity, if you've ever gone to a workshop, if you've ever read a book, you're not going to remember all of the things that you've read and all the things you've heard. You're only going to remember the few little things. And there was this particular nugget of truth that has remained with me ever since I heard him say those words. And he said this. He said, when it comes to your money, it should be really boring. And I remember taking note of that because it was the first time I'd heard somebody say that in the context of finances. What was he trying to illustrate? What was he saying? He said, listen, when it comes to money, what you want is you want to manage it so well that when you have anything to do with it, or when it becomes part of a reality in your life, that it doesn't raise your heart rate. It doesn't cause you to get excited in a negative way. You want it to be really very boring. So Hildy and I were away on vacation for a brief time. We were out of town, so as is our practice, we turned the water off in our house. So when we came home, we turned the water back on. Everything was fine until the morning when Hildy went down into the basement, and she came back and reported to me that there was a river in our basement, and I should explore to see what this was all about. So I went down, discovered that our water heater had sprung a leak. Well, I know a guy. So I called this person, I said, can you help me out? And sure enough, he was able to, and within a day, we had this water heater repaired. The person that came and installed the water heater, finally there comes that moment when you have to pay the bill. And so I hand him my Visa card, and we go through the transaction, and I go upstairs because I'll tell you, my money got a little excited for a moment. I want to tell you, I have now purchased the single most expensive water heater I've ever installed in any house I've ever lived in. And I came up to Hildy, and I sort of said, I'm sorry to say, but this is what the bill is. And she made our money very boring very quickly because she turned to me. She's the accountant in our family. She turned to me and she said, we've made plans for that. We've been saving for a while. We can cover this bill. It's not something to be worried about. In fact, that evening we sat around supper and the water heater never came up again because it was so boring. It wasn't exciting. But when I talk about your money being exciting, you know what I'm talking about, right? We're living in times that are exciting, maybe towards the negative when it comes to our finances. But I shared with you this story out of Egypt where Joseph interprets the dream of the Pharaoh. And I can imagine that during those 7 years when they were collecting the harvest and setting it aside for the 7 years of famine, during those 7 years of plenty, I imagine that the Egyptians probably had a few less slices of bread, maybe a few less bagels, flour, tortillas, whatever else they had to sort of deny themselves for a time because they knew a famine was coming and they were stockpiling the grain. A fifth, 20% of all the grain produced in the country was set aside for a future opportunity. And this is the reality that you and I know about. We know that there is a good practice when it comes around our money that makes it boring, which is when we, in our decision-making, allow for a future possibility, a future something. Now, all of our creation is built around this. It's literally the whole practice of collecting resources to be used at some point down the road happens all the time. So I'm a sailor. I was on the boat this weekend, and sitting in the sailboat, I was struck by all of the things around me that reminded me of this truth of creation. So first thing, you take a motor at the back of your boat that takes you through the channels of the harbor, out past the breakwater, out into the open water of Lake Winnipeg. There comes this magic moment when you turn off the engine and you experience the wind pushing you along. Even more pleasurable now, because sitting in that boat and being driven along by the wind reminded me that I'm in a vehicle that's moving forward, and it doesn't cost me a single penny in gas, because it's just the wind that's moving me along. Now, I know what wind is. Wind is what happens when air moves around because of temperature differences. And this same wind that ultimately builds our entire weather system is the same wind that I'm now harnessing to move a boat that weighs 4.5 tons. Like, it's a lot of weight that's moving through the water. And so I was sitting there enjoying this experience, and then I noticed the sun and realized this sun is now warming up Lake Winnipeg, this body of water that's much larger than it has ever been in my lifetime because the water is so high. And this water is going to rise up into the sky. It's going to turn into clouds. It's going to drift over the land and then shed rain, and it's going to run back into the lake. And the entire cycle is about literally resources being stored and used for some future need. And the cycle just keeps going, keeps going, keeps going. And then I look at the sun, and I think to myself, I hope that thing never runs out of batteries, because we really count on it all the time, because it renews us in all kinds of ways. It brings warmth, and that radiates to places where it's useful. And while I'm looking at the sun, I realize that right in that very moment, as I'm seeing the sun, there are people on the other side of the globe who experience the blessing of the sun because it's reflecting off the moon. And there is that whole notion again of resources being harnessed for things that are to come. Like, it's always this sort of exchange of resources. This is true in so many different places in Scripture. Proverbs chapter 6 says it this way: "Go to the ant, you sluggard. Consider its ways and be wise. It has no commander, no overseer or ruler, yet it stores its provisions in summer and gathers its food at harvest." Proverbs, I think there's more. "How long will you lie there, you sluggard? When will you get up from your sleep? A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest, and poverty will come on you like a thief, and scarcity like an armed man." So even just watching ants, we recognize that there is wisdom there in watching them conduct their business to prepare for a future. Here's another verse out of Proverbs: "The wise store up choice food and olive oil. Fools gulp theirs down." So I want to take us back to our longings. Our longings. The idea that perhaps you and I have longings that come to mind. Some of them are perhaps pipe dreams. They are out of reach. And I'd encourage you, I don't want to kill your dreams, but I would encourage you, be deliberate in discerning what your longings are, what your future intentions are, because some of them you will have to set aside and say, I think that's outside of my reach, and you just have to face the reality. But in addition to that, I would just encourage you, as you named a longing in your mind, as I earlier asked you to do such a thing, I would encourage you to think about this longing that you named and ask yourself this question: are you prepared to make decisions today, to sacrifice something today to achieve that longing in the future? You see, this is the critical thing. This is where it comes down to us actually assessing our longings to say, well, is this longing in fact worth pursuing? Is this something I'm prepared to invest in? And as you take stock, you may discover that this longing that you've named, it's a fleeting thing. It'll give you pleasure for only a brief bit of time. So probably it's not inspiring enough for you to decide, I will make decisions today. I will sacrifice something today in order for that longing to come true. Matthew chapter 6 says it this way: let's give Shauna a hand. It's not Rejoice on the thing. She's doing a great job. She just jumped in this morning to help out. So Shauna, thank you so much for all your efforts. I really appreciate this. "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moths and vermin destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moths and vermin do not destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." This, I think, defines so many different things. It allows you and I to assess our longings and to say, well, okay, does it fall into any of the criteria that is listed here? And the thing that I'm confronted by and that you'll be confronted by in this very moment is that I own a lot of things that are subject to moths and vermin and rust and decay. I'm embarrassed. I walk in my garage. I've saved pieces of wood from projects for some future use at some point. Now my garage is full up to the rafters with all kinds of stuff. And it's all about this future idea. But really, I ask myself the question, like, does this capture the value, the true things that I want it to be about in my lifetime? How do I feel about all the things that I've amassed? Think about your homes. Hildy and I are in the process of purging some things because we're overwhelmed by all that we own. And at some point when we purchase these things, they seem to be very important to us, but now they've lost their luster. So this is a truth that we have to face because I think these things are included in all of our lives. Do we really, in our longings, want to add yet another thing to this list of things? I think we'll want to be careful. There's another verse in 1 Timothy. This is given to Timothy, a young leader in the church, by the Apostle Paul, and he says, "But godliness with contentment is great gain, for we brought nothing into the world, and we can take nothing out of it. But if we have food and clothing, we will be content with that." Is that true? Would I be content with food and clothing? But there's so many other things that make my life pretty glorious. I don't know if I'm prepared to give them up. But it again begs the question, when I name a longing in my heart, when I think about something that perhaps I would consider investing in today for the future outcome of this longing, do I need anything at all? Or perhaps I have enough. So today, I think I want to invite us to not think about save all you can as much as think about what is the longing for which we would save all we can. Let the thing that represents the treasure of our hearts be the thing that we give attention to before we commit ourselves to save all we can. And by all means, all of creation tells us the story that the notion of setting aside resources today for a future use is absolutely wise. It is absolutely the right thing to do, but can we make sure that we set goals for things that in fact are and carry the value that we want them to have? This is the challenge for us. In the process of preparing for today, I bumped into an additional thought in all of this. And here is our vision statement. At TMP, we follow Jesus and share his story, gather in our place and yours, serve where needed, and worship him in all we do. Well, one of the things we talk about is that we will share his story. And when we share his story, what is his story? What's the thing that we're sharing? Well, here is the thing. If I went for a walk with God, and I would turn to him and would say to him, "What are you longing for?" He would tell me the same thing every time we would meet. What is he longing for? He is longing to be in relationship with the people that he's created and loves, and he wishes to spend eternity with them. That would never change. His longing is defined and settled. And if I turned to him and I would say, "God, what is it that you're prepared to sacrifice and give and invest today so that that future longing can come to be true?" And he would turn to me and say, "I've already done it. I've given my most precious thing. I've given my one and only Son, Jesus, who came to earth to remind the people that I love so much of my love, that they would choose to follow me." The invitation still stands for us this day. He has a longing. He has made the investment. In fact, save all you can is a perfect byline for God. Save all you can. And I'm confronted by his story. And I want to align my life story more with his. I want my longings to be more in line with his. I want my investment, my saving all you can, to match or to be of the same spirit of what he has modeled for me. So when it comes to our longings, can I invite myself again to be discerning and to be deliberate in our choices and to be careful with our longings, so that when we commit to the process of save all we can, that it's about something that carries value beyond something that's temporary and fleeting. Let's think about our longings again. Thanks.
Pastor Bob, you were courageous to take on a Sunday morning in the giving series. Appreciate your words this morning. Lots of questions and comments. I love when people are being playful with what you were saying and kind of doing different things with it. So I just wanted to read you one comment that somebody said. This isn't a question, but rather an observation. Despite the fact that you're talking of finances, it occurs to me that we can also spend our time building our faith in our relationship with Christ in the time when we're emotionally healthy, because life can turn, and when things are tough and you may need to rely on what you've built with Christ in the healthy times, that can take you through the tough times.
Excellent observation. Clearly, more application than just one.
Okay.
Very good. Thanks for sharing that.
But there were some questions here that are hard questions.
Yeah.
Pharaoh's dream comes to him in the 7 years of plenty. It helps him make steps for the years of lack. What do you do if you find yourself in yet another recession without significant savings set aside?
Yeah. It occurred to me that in this instance, in this story, what we have is we have the benefits of a dream given to Pharaoh by God, which gave him the understanding that the 7 years that he was entering into were in fact years of plenty, to prepare himself for the years of scarcity. But the truth of the matter is you and I may not find out that we're in times of plenty, because we live in a society where all the messages we're receiving have to do with you want more, you need more, and spend more. And so then there's this idea that, this is how we manage our finances, the idea of setting aside, never mind 20%, a portion of our earnings is almost counter-cultural to the message we're receiving. So what occurred to me in thinking about this, that we wouldn't know that we were in a season of plenty, that perhaps we need to treat seasons, all of our seasons, as seasons where we need to allow for margin. Now, that doesn't help this particular person who finds himself in this difficulty. I would say to you this, as far as a very practical response, if this is something where perhaps the wisdom of another voice in your life to look at your finances to help you make good decisions, certainly for the future. We have people within this faith community who offer to do those kinds of financial coaching at no cost to you. They would literally meet with you and talk with you about some of those things. So that would be a very practical response that we could offer. That would require for you to identify yourself, to be willing to say, this is who I am, and these are my circumstances. But we would hold that in great confidence, and we would love to come alongside you and assist you with that. So if you want to send an email to our info@themeetingplace.mb.ca and say, hey, I'm this person, or if you would somehow indicate, perhaps in the Q&R response, to say, yeah, you can use this number, call me, we would follow up with you to see if we can give you some practical insights that may be of assistance to you. And then further to that, we have a care fund that this faith community contributes towards that's available for us to distribute funds to people in need. So if you find yourself in a desperate state, then there are ways that we might come alongside and cover a bill of yours or something that will just give you a little bit of breathing room. So those would be very practical responses.
This one is in response to that text that you read, the story about Pharaoh. This person says, I always skipped over the part where Joseph explains the second dream means God decided that the famine will happen soon. I used to treat this passage as an example of God's provision, but I'm not so sure, because the worldwide famine was God's idea. Lots to speak about in 15 seconds, so they're suggesting maybe like another whole morning. But,
yeah, of course.
Right? Do you want to just address that?
Yeah. Yes, the reality is that because we believe in a God that's actively involved in our life, we want to, in some ways, credit him for good things, and we certainly blame him for bad things. And this text would tell us that he had a hand in this. And you would say, well, what kind of cruel God would do such a thing? Well, the reality is that I think famines and plentiful harvests are commonplace. They're part of the cycle of. Right now in Manitoba, we have a deluge of water. Out in Calgary, sort of southern Alberta area, they've been under drought conditions for 2 years. So to say that God made this happen, I have a sense that in some cases we think that God's hand is involved very directly, but in some instances, I think what's happening is that the natural course of the things that he's put into place is unfolding. So in this instance, if we look at this and say, what does this tell us about the nature and the character of God? We can for sure say that he's involved. He's not absent, he's not distant, but rather he's very actively involved. He has created a provision knowing there are difficulty that's coming. What we don't understand is, was it necessary for the nations to go through a famine because it was a call to return to him? Was there another longing that he was expressing through the difficulty? Because as Philip Yancey says, God speaks constantly and he yells at us in our pain. Like he shouts at us, he tries to get our attention. So is there a possibility that this was perhaps a disciplinary thing that God instituted because it would ultimately serve a bigger purpose? That's not included in the story, but the possibility for that exists.
One last question, many that I didn't get to. What is a good place for me to start to align my longings more closely with God's?
Read his word. Discover his heart. I think any text we read in Scripture, we should always ask ourselves the question, what does it tell us and teach us about the nature of God? And then join him in the work that he desires to do. Anything that's specific in alignment with where his heartbeat is going, we know that it's going to be pleasing. We know it's going to have eternal value. It's going to last longer than where moths and vermin can get at it. So that would be my word of advice.
Thank you.
Yep. Thanks, Carolyn. Save All You Can was the title of this morning's teach. And yet, I want to invite you instead to look more carefully at our longings. As I'm taking a look at my longings and you look at your longings, perhaps it'll help us to figure out how to, in fact, assign our resources today for some future outcome. As all of creation illustrates for us to be responsible in this way, I would just encourage you to engage this in your thinking. And the very next purchase that you're about to make, just stop for a moment and consider, how does this fit into some of the texts we looked at today? Matthew 6, Proverbs, 1 Timothy, to give us an understanding of what true values might actually be. Thank you for being here. Happy Father's Day to many of you. If you would like prayer, there will be people at the front of the stage willing to engage in that conversation with you and pray with you. Bless you today as you head out into gorgeous sunshine and very, very warm weather. See you next Sunday.